How did Nokia go from this to this? How did they lose everything? So if you're old enough, you may remember when Nokia absolutely dominated the mobile phone industry. They were the king of mobile phones. Their reputation was built around making extremely durable phones that could literally survive a drop from great heights. But today, Nokia doesn't even exist anymore. In fact, in Q2 of 2022, they had just a 0.66% global market share. And the most shocking part about their downfall is that it happened so fast. Just over a decade ago, in 2010, they still held an impressive 28% market share. So how did a titan like Nokia collapse overnight? Well, that's what we're gonna look at in today's video. Before we get into the rise and fall of Nokia, let's take a look at some fun facts about the company. First of all, despite being a Finnish company, they're actually pronounced Nokia, not Nokia. And despite being a tech company, they actually didn't start out as a tech company at all. In fact, they started out as a paper mill in 1865, and over the next decades, they expanded into other areas such as rubber and cables. However, their biggest breakthrough didn't happen until 1965 when they entered the electronics industry. More specifically, they got into the telecommunications industry by producing mobile and radio telephone switching equipment. And in 1980, they got into the mobile phone industry. This is when they released their first mobile phone, the Mobira Senator. It was a massive success, selling 200 units within the first year. But it also had one pretty big problem, which was that it weighed 10 kilograms. Despite the weight issues, Nokia continued pushing forward, and in 1987, they released their second mobile phone, the Nokia 1011. This time it weighed a much more reasonable 2.5 kilograms, but it still came with one pretty big problem, which was its price tag of €4,000. But regardless, it would be their last analog phone, because in 1991, they released the Nokia 1011, which was the first GSM or global system for mobile communications phone. This basically allowed them to expand their customer base way beyond Finland. But it was also their last basic feature phone, because their real breakthrough didn't come until 2 years later, when they released the Nokia 2110. This wasn't just another ordinary mobile phone. In fact, it's safe to say that this was the first mainstream smartphone. I mean, the phone came with a color screen and the ability to store text and images. And this marked the beginning of their golden age. Over the next few years, they would release hit after hit, including the Nokia 3210, the Nokia 3310, and of course, the legendary Nokia 1100. It should also be noted that during this time, they popularized the Nokia ringtone and the game Snake. And these two things alone are pretty much ingrained into pop culture at this point. But what made Nokia so successful? Why were their phones so insanely popular? Well, there are 3 main reasons. First, their indestructible design. Everyone knows someone who has a Nokia brick. Second, their insane battery life. Back in the early 2000s, the average person only needed a phone for maybe 20 minutes per day. So it made sense for Nokia to focus on maximizing battery life. Third, their simple interface. Basically, Nokia phones were very easy to use, and this made them especially popular among the elderly. As a result of these 3 factors, Nokia reached their peak in 2007 when they controlled 49% of the global market. But this is also when the first cracks started showing up. And the reason for this is because that same year, Apple would introduce the iPhone. Now, initially, Apple only had a 2% market share, so it wasn't really a threat. But as the years went on, more and more consumers switched to smartphones. They wanted apps, better screens, and touch screens. Meanwhile, Nokia remained focused on hardware. They stuck with their dumb phones and Symbian OS, and Symbian OS was one of their biggest mistakes. On the surface, it looked good. After all, it was incredibly stable and reliable. but it was very limiting in terms of development. It was also very difficult for developers to create apps for Symbian OS, and this led to a big rift between consumers and Nokia. By 2010, their market share had already fallen from 49% to 28%. And at this point, they knew that they needed to make a change. So in late 2010, they partnered with Microsoft. At this point, Microsoft was still seen as the underdog compared to Apple and Google. But Nokia believed that Windows Phone OS was the best option that they had. And in 2011, they fully adopted the platform. Microsoft also seemed to believe in Nokia because they gave them exclusive rights to use certain technologies such as XAML and Silverlight. This meant that Nokia could create far more powerful apps than before. And in 2012, they launched their first Lumia device, the Lumia 800. The phone was a massive success, selling 1.7 million units within the first 6 months. And Nokia followed up with the 808 PureView, which sold even better, moving 3.5 million units within 4 months. But while the sales were solid, the phones weren't exactly a game changer. And Nokia soon found themselves falling behind once again. By now, everyone was either on Team iPhone or Team Android. Developers were obviously prioritizing iOS and Android because that's where the most users were. And consumers were slowly realizing this as well. So by the time Nokia, the Lumia 125, they only controlled 4% of the market. The writing was clearly on the wall. It was time for Nokia to make a decision. Should they continue pushing with Microsoft, or should they switch to iOS or Android? Well, they did try dabbling with Android a bit by releasing to Android tablets, but ultimately, they decided to stick with Microsoft. They felt that it was too risky to switch to a completely different operating system. And they figured that they could turn things around with Windows Phone 8. Now, in hindsight, this was definitely their biggest mistake because Windows Phone 8 ended up being a massive flop. Sure, the Lumia phones themselves weren't necessarily bad. In fact, the Lumia 920 was one of the best Windows phones ever made. But the operating system was far behind the competition. It lacked basic features such as multitasking and file management, and this inevitably led to poor sales. To make matters worse, Microsoft stopped prioritizing Nokia. They started focusing on their own Surface line of devices, leaving Nokia in the dust. By this point, their phone division was losing billions of dollars per year, and it was clear that they couldn't survive much longer. In 2014, Microsoft would buy out their entire phone business for $7.2 billion, and they would eventually abandon it in 2016, thus marking the official end of Nokia phones. Now, even though Nokia lost their dominant position in the mobile phone industry, there is a bit of a happy ending to this story. You see, Nokia was owned by a company called Nokia Corporation, and when Microsoft took over Nokia devices, Nokia Corporation still existed. They kept all of their telecom and networking businesses, and these businesses are still around today. In fact, in 2021, they made $10 billion. So at least Nokia still exists, just not in the form that we're all familiar with. So why did Nokia fall? Why did they go from dominating the industry to collapsing overnight? Well, there are mainly 2 reasons. First, arrogance. If you look back at every decision that Nokia made, they doubled down on what they were good at, which was hardware. They never really took risks, and this led them to ignoring trends such as smartphones, apps, and touch screens. And second, slow decision-making. Nokia was a huge company, and when a large corporation becomes successful, it often takes a lot of time for them to change direction. In Nokia's case, it took them nearly a decade to transition from feature phones to smartphones, and by then it was already too late. All in all, Nokia fell because they refused to connect with the future, despite connecting billions of people. But that's just what happened. Hopefully you learned something from this video. If you did, please leave a like, and if you want to watch more videos like this, please stay tuned. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.